Growing up, Robert and his friend Mike often felt like outsiders. They weren't exactly poor, but they definitely weren't rich. Most of their classmates had nicer clothes, newer toys, and went on fancier vacations. This difference made Robert feel a sting of exclusion, a feeling that kept nagging at him. He saw how their parents struggled, how his own dad, a highly educated man, still worried about bills and never seemed to get ahead. This constant worry, this financial tightrope walk, made Robert intensely curious. He didn't want to live like that. He wanted to understand money, not just earn it, but truly understand how to make it work for him. He wanted to be rich. One afternoon, after another day of feeling the subtle weight of not having enough, Robert approached his father. "Dad," he started, "how do you get rich?" His poor dad, a kind man with a good heart but a worried expression, paused. He thought for a moment, then said, "Son, you need to go to school, get good grades, and find a secure job. Work hard, save your money, and you'll be fine." It was the standard advice, the kind everyone gave, but something about it didn't sit right with Robert. It sounded like a plan to avoid being poor, not a plan to get rich. It didn't feel like the answer he was looking for. Robert pressed further. "But Dad, you've done all that, and we're not rich." His poor dad sighed, a familiar sound of resignation. "Well, son, it's not that simple. Life is hard. You just have to accept it and keep working." This wasn't the inspiring answer Robert craved. He wanted solutions, not acceptance of struggle. Seeing his son's disappointment, poor dad had an idea. "Why don't you talk to Mike's father?" he suggested. "He's starting to build up a business. Maybe he knows something I don't." The suggestion caught Robert off guard. Mike's father, Rich Dad, as the boys would later call him, wasn't exactly known for his wealth at that time. He owned a few small businesses, yes, but he certainly didn't live in a mansion or drive a fancy car. In fact, compared to Robert's own father, who held a respected government position, Mike's dad seemed, to a casual observer, to be doing just okay, perhaps even struggling a bit more. He wasn't the picture of success that Robert had in mind when he thought of rich. Still, the idea sparked something in Robert. Mike's dad was different. He wasn't an academic, but he had a drive, a way of looking at things that was unconventional. Robert knew he had nothing to lose by asking. He confided in Mike about his conversation with his own father and the suggestion to talk to Mike's dad. Mike, always eager for an adventure, was immediately on board. They both felt a mix of curiosity and a little bit of skepticism. How could someone who wasn't obviously wealthy teach them about getting rich? It felt like a gamble, a shot in the dark. But it was a shot they were willing to take. They were just kids, but they already understood that the path their parents were on wasn't leading to the kind of freedom they imagined. They were hungry for a different kind of knowledge, a secret that their own educated father didn't seem to possess. So, with a shared sense of purpose, they decided to approach Mike's father, hoping he held the key to unlocking the mystery of wealth, even if his current status didn't quite reflect it. They knew one thing for sure. They didn't want to end up like the adults around them, always working for money, always worried. They wanted more. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The boys, full of a strange mix of hope and doubt, finally found the courage to approach Mike's father. They walked into his small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and ambition. Mike's dad, a man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened patiently as Robert, slightly nervous, explained his desire to learn about money and getting rich. He didn't laugh or dismiss them, which was a relief. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "So, you want to learn how to get rich, huh?" he finally said, his voice deep and calm. "Most people just want a paycheck. They don't want to learn." Robert and Mike nodded eagerly. "Okay," Rich Dad continued. I'm not going to give you lectures. You won't learn anything sitting there listening to me talk. You learn by doing. You learn by experiencing things for yourselves. This was already different from Robert's own father, who believed in textbooks and classrooms. Rich Dad then offered them a job. "I'll pay you 10 cents an hour," he stated, watching their faces for a reaction. 10 cents an hour. It wasn't much, even for kids, but the promise of learning something new, something that could change their lives, was far more valuable than any immediate wage. Robert and Mike exchanged a quick glance. This wasn't the easy path, the instant solution they might have secretly hoped for, but it was a path. They were young, eager, and ready to trade their free time for this unconventional education. They both agreed, prioritizing this strange opportunity over playing baseball or riding their bikes. Their first assignment was at Mrs. Martin's store, one of the small businesses Rich Dad owned. The task was simple, yet surprisingly dull, cleaning shelves and tidying up the stockroom. Hour after hour, they dusted cans, organized boxes, and swept floors. The work was repetitive, monotonous, and frankly, boring. The pay was even less exciting. After 3 hours of back-breaking work, they each received a measly 30 cents. It was barely enough to buy a comic book, let alone feel like they were on the road to riches. Day after day, they showed up at Mrs. Martin's. The routine never changed. Dusting, sweeping, stacking. The initial excitement of their job quickly wore off, replaced by a growing sense of tedium. Robert found himself counting the minutes, watching the clock tick by at an agonizingly slow pace. He had imagined grand lessons, secret formulas for wealth, not endless hours of cleaning. Where was the magic? Where was the wisdom? It felt like a trick, a way to get free labor. He started to question his decision, to wonder if he had been foolish to trust Mike's father. This wasn't learning. This was just plain work, and for almost no money at all. The promise of becoming rich felt further away than ever, hidden behind layers of dust and stacks of canned goods. He started to feel a deep frustration bubbling up inside him, a feeling of being exploited and undervalued. The dream of freedom and wealth seemed to shrink with every shelf he wiped clean. Robert's frustration grew steadily over the next 3 weeks. Each day felt like a carbon copy of the last, filled with the same dull tasks at Mrs. Martin's store. He dusted shelves, swept floors, and arranged cans, all for the same paltry 10 cents an hour. The initial spark of hope he felt when Rich Dad offered them the job had dwindled into a smoldering resentment. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He wanted to learn about money, about getting rich, not about the proper way to stack soup cans. He felt cheated, exploited, like a cheap laborer rather than a student of finance. The idea of becoming wealthy seemed like a distant, impossible fantasy, especially when his reality was 30 cents for 3 hours of mind-numbing work. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rich Dad was just using them, getting free help for his businesses while offering nothing but empty promises in return. One afternoon, after another particularly long and boring shift, Robert couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his broom against the wall, a burst of anger finally breaking through his quiet disappointment. "That's it," he declared to Mike, his voice tight with indignation. "I'm quitting. This is ridiculous. We're not learning anything. We're just free labor for your dad." Mike, who had been diligently wiping down a counter, looked up, a knowing expression on his face. He didn't seem surprised by Robert's outburst. In fact, he looked almost as if he had been expecting it. "He knew you'd say that," Mike said calmly, his words catching Robert completely off guard. Robert stared at him, confused. "What do you mean, he knew?" Mike shrugged. "My dad said you'd probably quit around the 3-week mark. He said it's part of the lesson." Robert felt a fresh wave of annoyance. A lesson? This felt more like a cruel joke. He had imagined profound insights, not psychological games. He thought about his own father, poor Dad, who would have had a very different reaction. Poor Dad would have advised him to stand up for himself, to demand a raise, or, failing that, to quit and find a job that paid fairly. That was the conventional wisdom, the logical approach. But Rich Dad, Mike explained, didn't believe in conventional wisdom when it came to teaching about money. He believed in experience. He says people don't learn from lectures, Mike continued, echoing Rich Dad's earlier words. They learn when they feel something, when they get fed up, when they get angry enough to want to change. Robert mulled over Mike's words, still skeptical, but a tiny bit intrigued. Was this really part of a larger plan? It still felt unfair, but the idea that Rich Dad had anticipated his exact reaction, his precise moment of frustration, was unsettling. It meant Rich Dad was playing a much deeper game than Robert had realized. He thought about poor Dad's advice. Go to school, get good grades, find a secure job. Poor Dad believed in following rules, in working hard within an established system. He believed in fair pay for fair work. His solution to Robert's current predicament would be simple. If the pay isn't good, ask for more or leave. He would see Rich Dad's actions as exploitative, as taking advantage of two young boys, and in many ways, Robert agreed with that assessment. He felt taken advantage of. But Mike's words, the idea that this was all part of a calculated lesson, introduced a new layer of complexity. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was a different way to look at work, at money, and at what truly constituted a valuable lesson. The anger was still there, hot and simmering, but beneath it, a tiny flicker of curiosity began to stir. He still planned to confront Rich Dad, to tell him exactly how he felt, but now he also wanted to understand. He wanted to know why Rich Dad had set up this strange, frustrating test. Robert stood before Rich Dad, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and youthful indignation. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head countless times, and now the words tumbled out, sharp and accusatory. "You're greedy," he blurted, his voice cracking slightly. "And you're disrespectful. You promised to teach us to get rich, but all you've done is make us clean your stores for practically nothing. You're just using us." Rich Dad listened patiently, his gaze steady, without a hint of surprise or offense. He let Robert finish, letting the boy's frustrations hang in the air for a moment. Then Rich Dad spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Robert," he began, "I understand why you feel that way. Many people would, but teaching isn't always about sitting you down and lecturing. Sometimes, the best lessons come from life itself. Life is the best teacher of all." Robert frowned, still unconvinced. He wanted answers, not philosophical statements. "What does that even mean?" he challenged. Rich Dad leaned forward slightly. "Life pushes us around," he explained. "All of us. Some people, when life pushes them, they just let it happen. They complain, they blame others. They say it's unfair. They resist learning the lesson." He paused, letting his words sink in. They get angry, they get scared, and they react with those emotions. They think a new job or a bigger paycheck will solve their problems. But it won't. Those feelings, that fear and greed, they just follow them wherever they go. That's how most people live their lives, reacting to life's pushes without ever truly learning from them. Robert felt a pang of recognition. He had been angry, he had felt exploited, and he had certainly blamed Rich Dad. He had also thought about quitting and finding another job, just like his poor dad would have advised. Rich Dad continued, "There are others, a much smaller group, who, when life pushes them, they look at those pushes as opportunities. They don't just react. They stop, they think, and they ask themselves, what is life trying to teach me here? They embrace the challenge. They see the pushes as lessons, not punishments. Robert shifted his weight, feeling a growing discomfort. He realized Rich Dad was talking about him, about his recent outburst, and about the way he had handled the low pay and the tedious work. He had definitely been in the first group, the ones who complained and blamed. "Most people quit," Rich Dad said, his eyes meeting Robert's. "They quit because the push feels too hard. They quit because they'd rather be comfortable than learn something new. They quit because they let their emotions control them. They let fear and greed dictate their choices. Fear of not having enough money, so they work harder. Greed for more money, so they work even harder. It's a cycle." Robert thought about his poor dad, who worked incredibly hard, always chasing the next paycheck, always worried about bills. Was he caught in that cycle? Poor Dad was highly educated, intelligent, but always seemed to be struggling financially. He worked for money, and the more he earned, the more he seemed to spend, never quite getting ahead. "The real lesson here, Robert, isn't about the 10 cents an hour," Rich Dad clarified. "It's about how you react to that 10 cents. It's about how you react when you feel undervalued, when you feel like you're being pushed. Are you going to let those feelings control you, or are you going to use them as a catalyst to learn something deeper?" Robert was starting to see it. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the mindset. Rich Dad wasn't just observing his work ethic. He was observing his emotional response, his resilience, his willingness to look beyond the surface. The anger hadn't completely disappeared, but it was now mixed with a dawning understanding, a glimmer of the deeper game Rich Dad was playing. This wasn't just getting free labor, it was a test, a highly unconventional, frustrating, but undeniably powerful test. He had come here wanting to learn how to get rich, and Rich Dad was showing him that the path to wealth wasn't just about accumulating money, but about mastering oneself. It was about facing life's pushes head-on without letting fear or greed take over. Rich Dad then explained that most people, when they think about work, only focus on the job itself and the paycheck that comes with it. They don't really understand the bigger picture, the actual purpose of their effort, beyond just earning enough to pay the bills. He told Robert that this was the core of what he called the rat race. People work hard, they get paid, and then they spend that money, only to realize they need more money, so they work harder again. It's a continuous cycle, a treadmill of earning and spending that keeps them trapped. He looked at Robert directly. "My intention with the 10-cent wage wasn't to be mean or to exploit you," Rich Dad said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It was to make you experience that push from life, but in a controlled way. I wanted you to feel the frustration, the sense of unfairness, the desire for more, right here, right now, in a situation where you could actually learn from it without real consequences." Robert remembered his initial complaint, how he had accused Rich Dad of greed and disrespect. He had felt those emotions intensely. He had been angry that his hard work was being valued so little. He had felt disrespected by the low pay, believing it didn't reflect the effort he put in. Now, hearing Rich Dad explain his reasoning, it started to make a different kind of sense. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about the feelings the lack of money generated. "Most people think the solution to their problems is more money," Rich Dad continued. "They believe if they just had a bigger paycheck, all their worries would disappear. But that's a trap. More money often just means more spending, bigger debts, and a faster run on the same treadmill. It doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is often a lack of financial education and a reliance on emotions rather than logic." Robert started to realize that his poor dad's way of thinking, always chasing a bigger salary, was exactly what Rich Dad was describing. Poor Dad worked incredibly hard. He was smart. He was well educated. But he was always just a few steps ahead of financial trouble. He was stuck in that cycle, always working for money, always needing more. The real solution, Rich Dad emphasized, isn't about getting more money in your pocket. It's about knowing how to make money work for you, instead of you working for money. It's about understanding the game, the rules, and how to play it effectively. Robert felt a slow realization dawning on him. The lesson wasn't about the specific amount he was paid, it was about the principle behind it. Rich Dad wasn't trying to save a few dollars by underpaying them. He was trying to teach them a fundamental truth about money and human behavior. He was showing them, through direct experience, how easily people fall into the trap of working for money, driven by the fear of not having enough and the greed for more. The anger fully subsided, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. It was like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He had come to Rich Dad wanting to learn how to get rich, and Rich Dad was showing him that the first step wasn't about finding a high-paying job, but about understanding the pitfalls of the typical financial path. It was about recognizing the emotional triggers that keep most people financially bound. Rich Dad watched Robert's face, seeing the shift in his expression. "You're starting to get it," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's not about how much you earn. It's about how much you learn. And it's about what you do with what you earn, and what you learn." This whole experience, the tedious work, the low pay, the frustration, it was all part of a larger, more profound lesson about financial intelligence and self-mastery. Robert had always thought getting rich was about getting a lot of money. Now he was beginning to see it was about something else entirely. Freedom from the cycle, freedom from fear, and the ability to make his money work for him. The 10 cents an hour was just the beginning of that journey, a small but significant push that would lead to much bigger insights. Rich Dad paused, letting his words sink in. He then looked at both Robert and Mike, a new challenge forming in his eyes. "All right," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "From this moment on, I'm not going to pay you anything. Not a single cent. You both can work for me for free, or you can go back to chasing 10 cents an hour, or you can go back to doing whatever else you want to do with your time." Robert's jaw dropped. Mike looked equally stunned. Work for free? After all that talk about the lesson, about the push, about understanding money, now they were supposed to work for nothing. It felt like another test. A bigger one this time. The anger Robert had just managed to push down started to bubble up again. But he caught himself. He remembered Rich Dad's words about emotions controlling choices. This was it. This was the real push. They looked at each other, then back at Rich Dad. There was no malice in his eyes, just an unwavering expectation. It was clear he wasn't joking. This was a serious offer, a serious challenge. Robert thought about Mrs. Martin's store, the dusty shelves, the repetitive tasks. Doing it for free felt absurd. But then he remembered the feeling when he'd been paid 10 cents, the feeling of being exploited. Was working for free even worse, or was it somehow different? Mike was the first to speak. "For free?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Rich Dad simply nodded. "For free. And I want you to use your minds, really use them. Think about how you can make money work for you, even when there's no money coming in directly from me. This is where the real learning begins." So, for the next 3 weeks, Robert and Mike continued to work at Mrs. Martin's store, cleaning shelves, stacking goods, and doing all the little chores. But this time, without a single penny changing hands. It was tough. The physical labor was the same, but the psychological aspect was entirely different. There was no expectation of reward, no small coin to look forward to at the end of the day. It forced them to think. If they weren't working for money, what were they working for? What was the point? After those 3 weeks, Rich Dad called them back to his office. He sat them down, his gaze steady. "So," he began, "what have you two learned in the last 3 weeks?" Robert and Mike exchanged glances. They hadn't really discussed it much. each grappling with the strange situation in his own head. Robert mumbled something about how it felt pointless, how he missed the 10 cents. Mike talked about how boring the work was without the pay. Rich Dad listened patiently, then he leaned forward. "Let me tell you about Mrs. Martin," he said. "She works hard, doesn't she? Every day from morning till night she's in that store. She makes enough to get by, to keep the store running, to pay her bills. And what does she dream of?" Robert thought about it. Mrs. Martin always talked about her park, the small patch of green where she liked to sit on her days off, which were rare. "She dreams of her park," Rich Dad continued. "And what about the people who come to her store? The ones who work hard all week, waiting for Friday, waiting for those 2 weeks of vacation once a year? They work, they get paid, they pay their bills, and they dream of their short escape. They constantly seek job security, a steady paycheck, and a few days of freedom. They live their lives working for money, exchanging their precious time for a small, predictable sum." He paused, letting the image sink in. "They are like Mrs. Martin in a way. They work hard, but they don't really use their minds to change their situation. They accept the cycle. They accept the idea that the only way to get money is to work for it, directly. They don't make their money work for them." Robert started to see the connection. He and Mike had been doing the exact same thing, just on a smaller scale. They were working for money, and when the money stopped, they felt lost, confused, and frustrated. "Now," Rich Dad said, a glint in his eye, "I'm going to make you an offer. I'll pay you 25 cents an hour for your work. How does that sound?" Robert's heart leaped. 25 cents. That was more than double what he'd been making before. It was tempting, very tempting. He could buy so many comics with that. He looked at Mike, who also had a flicker of excitement in his eyes. "Or," Rich Dad added, "I could pay you $1 an hour, or even $2 an hour." He was testing them, pushing them again, but this time with the lure of more money, not the absence of it. It was a test of their resolve, a challenge to see if they had truly understood the lesson about not working for money, but making money work for them. The offers were designed to tempt them back into the rat race, but with a higher salary. The offers from Rich Dad hung in the air, heavy with temptation. Robert felt a strong pull, a familiar ache for the things money could buy. His mind instantly conjured images of new baseball cards, more comics, maybe even that new toy he'd seen in the store window. It was a powerful urge, the kind that had always driven his desire to get rich. This was the moment where the weak, needy part of his soul, as Rich Dad might put it, cried out for immediate gratification. It was the part that saw only the numbers, 25 cents, $1, $2, and not the underlying lesson. He glanced at Mike, whose eyes, for a fleeting second, mirrored Robert's own yearning. The thought of earning $2 an hour felt huge, an almost unimaginable sum for a kid their age. It would solve so many of their small, everyday problems. It would bring comfort, alleviate the feeling of being left out, give them a sense of power. This was exactly how most people got trapped, Robert realized. They saw the money, felt the fear of not having it or the greed for more of it, and they jumped. They sold their time, their effort, their minds for a paycheck without truly understanding the bigger picture. But then, a different feeling began to surface within Robert. It was a quieter, more resilient part, one that had been stirred by Rich Dad's unconventional teachings. This part remembered the frustration of the 10-cent wage, the emptiness of working solely for money, and the profound shift when they started working for free. It was the part that understood the value of learning over earning, of insight over immediate reward. Rich Dad wasn't just offering money, he was offering a test, a chance to see if they had truly grasped the concept of making money work for them instead of working for money. The silence stretched, filled only with the faint hum of the city outside and the rapid beating of Robert's own heart. He was fighting an internal battle, a war between his immediate desires and his burgeoning understanding. The temptation was real, a siren song promising an easier path, a quicker fix. But deep down, he knew that taking the bait would mean failing the true lesson. It would mean going back to being controlled by fear and greed, exactly what Rich Dad was trying to teach them to overcome. Rich Dad watched them both, his expression unreadable. He wasn't pushing them, not anymore. He was letting them wrestle with their own minds, their own emotions. This was the moment of truth, the point where a choice had to be made. Would they be swayed by the promise of more money, or would they hold on to the invaluable lesson they had begun to uncover? Then, Rich Dad pushed it even further. "All right," he said, his voice calm. "How about $5 an hour? That's a good wage, isn't it? More than many adults make. You could buy anything you want." $5 an hour. That number hit Robert with even greater force. It was an astronomical sum, a fortune. For a moment, his resolve wavered. He could picture himself walking into the comic book store, buying every single issue. He could get that new bike. The possibilities seemed endless. It felt like Rich Dad was trying to break them, to see if there was a price at which their newfound understanding would crumble. But then, something clicked into place. The very enormity of the offer, the way Rich Dad had kept increasing it, made the lesson even clearer. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the principle. It was about whether they would choose to be free or to be bound. Robert looked at Mike. Mike met his gaze, and in his eyes, Robert saw the same quiet determination. They had gone through this together, the initial confusion, the frustration, the dawning realization. They had worked for free, not for money, but for knowledge. And that knowledge, that understanding, felt far more valuable than any sum Rich Dad was offering. "No, thank you," Robert said, his voice surprisingly steady, a quiet confidence in his tone. Mike nodded in agreement. Rich Dad's lips finally curved into a genuine smile, a proud glint in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. They had passed the test. They had chosen the resilient part of their souls. They had understood that some things, like true financial freedom and self-mastery, were priceless. They had refused to be controlled by fear or greed, even when faced with significant temptation. They had learned that being truly rich wasn't about earning more money, but about having the wisdom to operate beyond the lure of it. They had bought into the idea that their time and their minds were worth more than any hourly wage. This refusal was not a rejection of money itself, but a rejection of the idea that money was the ultimate master. It was a declaration of their intent to master money rather than be mastered by it. Rich Dad then finally articulated the concept of the rat race, a term that would stick with Robert for the rest of his life. He explained that many people start working out of fear. The fear of not having enough money, the fear of losing their job, the fear of not being able to pay their bills. This fear drives them to seek employment, to work hard for a paycheck. But once they get that paycheck, another emotion often takes over: greed. The desire for more things, newer things, better things. This greed pushes them to work even harder, to get promotions, to earn more money, just to buy more stuff. It's a never-ending cycle, a treadmill where they run faster and faster but never truly get ahead. They're like rats in a maze, constantly chasing a piece of cheese that never quite satisfies them, always being driven by these primal emotions of fear and greed. They think more money will solve their problems, Rich Dad said, his eyes scanning Robert and Mike. But it often just makes the cycle spin faster. They get a raise, they buy a bigger house, a fancier car, and suddenly their expenses are higher, and they need even more money to maintain that new lifestyle. So they work harder, driven by the same old fears and desires. They are trapped. Mike, who had been listening intently, finally broke the silence. So, what's the alternative, Rich Dad? Is there another way out of this rat race? His question hung in the air, a genuine plea for understanding. Rich Dad smiled again, a knowing look on his face. The first step, he began, is to tell the truth to yourself about your feelings. Most people let their emotions control them. They react to fear by working harder, and they react to greed by spending more. They don't stop to think, to observe their own reactions. They don't ask themselves why they feel the way they do, or what those feelings are telling them. He explained that the path to financial freedom wasn't about avoiding fear or greed altogether, because those emotions are a natural part of being human. Instead, it was about learning to acknowledge them, to understand them, and then to choose how to respond. It was about using your mind to observe your emotions, rather than letting your emotions dictate your actions. When you feel fear about not having money, Rich Dad continued, most people's first instinct is to go get a job, to seek security. But a truly financially intelligent person will ask themselves, what can I learn from this fear? How can I use this situation to become stronger, smarter, and more capable? He contrasted this with those who allow their emotions to control them. These people are always looking for a quick fix, a temporary solution to their financial anxieties. They chase the next paycheck, the next promotion, the next big purchase, believing that these external things will bring them lasting security or happiness. But they never truly confront the underlying issues, the deeply ingrained patterns of fear and greed that keep them running in place. Working for money to alleviate fear, Rich Dad concluded, is a futile exercise. The fear will always come back demanding more. True financial freedom comes from making money work for you, from acquiring assets that generate income, and from educating yourself to understand how money truly operates. It's about building a system, not just earning a wage. It's about turning those emotions of fear and greed into fuel for learning and innovation, rather than letting them drive you into a perpetual cycle of working harder for diminishing returns. Robert and Mike listened, their young minds absorbing every word. They had just passed a crucial test, refusing the lure of easy money to seek a deeper understanding. They now saw the rat race not just as a concept, but as a tangible trap that most adults fell into. They understood that their refusal of Rich Dad's offers wasn't just about turning down a few dollars. It was a declaration of their intent to break free from that cycle. They had chosen to use their minds, to learn, and to build a different future, one where they would control money instead of being controlled by it. This was the first, most important step on their long journey to true wealth.